The old farmhouse had withstood over 100 storms, standing resilient against nature's fury. But tonight's blizzard, it was something different, so relentless that it forced travelers off the highway in droves. Samuel Miller, a widowed farmer who had spent 3 decades tending the same land his father once worked, never turned away a soul in need. It was just his nature. His life, often lonely and filled with unanswered questions about his past, felt meaningful whenever he could help others. But this night would be unlike any other. When a rain-soaked visitor knocked on his door, flashing a badge, Samuel's world shifted in ways he never imagined. Welcome to Unfolding Tales. Today I bring you a story filled with fate, mystery and revelations. So let's dive in. Samuel Miller's mornings had always begun the same way. Before the first light of dawn, before the world had fully woken. It had been this way for 30 years. The daily routine never wavered. A pot of coffee brewed in the very same machine his late wife, Sarah, had chosen long ago, before cancer took her from him 7 years earlier. The farmhouse, old and full of history, creaked with familiar sounds. Yet without Sarah it often felt too large, too empty. The weather forecast had been clear. An intense winter storm was approaching. As Samuel sipped his coffee, his gaze lingered on the empty chairs around his kitchen table. Holidays were the hardest. His son Michael had moved to the city right after high school, chasing opportunities far from the quiet countryside. They spoke occasionally, but visits were just another day, Samuel muttered, pulling on his work boots. The farm kept him busy. 60 acres of corn, a small herd of cattle, and endless tasks that filled the daylight hours. It was a blessing in disguise, really. The hard labor left little room for dwelling on thoughts that had haunted him since childhood. Samuel had been adopted at the age of 4. His adoptive parents, good-hearted and loving, had shared little about his origins. They told him only that his birth mother had been too young to care for him. No name, no details, no past to trace. By afternoon, the sky darkened ominously. The wind howled through the trees, bending them at unnatural angles. Sensing the storm's fury, Samuel secured the barn doors and hurried back inside just as fat raindrops pelted the roof. The storm raged on into the evening. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rumbling like a distant battle cry. Samuel sat alone in his living room, a well-worn photo album spread across his lap. Faded pictures of his adoptive parents, Sarah, of Michael as a bright-eyed boy. Memories locked in time. Then a sudden knock at the door. The sound jolted him. Who would be out in this weather? When he opened the door, 3 figures stood shivering on his porch, drenched from head to toe. "Our car slid off the road a mile back," a woman explained, her voice trembling. "We saw your lights." Come in," Samuel said without hesitation, stepping aside. Highways brutal in storms like this. The strangers introduced themselves as the Thompsons, a middle-aged couple and their grown son, James. They were traveling to a family reunion when the storm had caught them off guard. "I can take you into town when the weather clears," Samuel offered. "But for tonight, you're welcome to stay here." Relief washed over Mrs. Thompson's face. "Thank you." Not many people would open their home to strangers these days. Samuel offered a small smile. "My father always taught me, never turn away someone in need. Besides, this house has been empty for far too long." He handed them towels, stoked the fireplace, and set about preparing a simple meal, hot soup and sandwiches. The farmhouse had more than enough room, and honestly, company was nice. He wasn't used to it. Mr. Thompson glanced at the framed photographs on the wall. "This land been in your family long?" "My adoptive father bought it in the 50s, Samuel answered. "I took over when he got too old to manage it. Been here ever since." James, still pale despite the warmth, coughed lightly. "You all right there?" Samuel asked. Mrs. Thompson pressed a hand to her son's forehead. "He's been fighting a cold for days now." "I've got medicine upstairs," Samuel said, already heading toward the hallway. "And extra blankets too." As the evening wore on, the conversation flowed more easily. Samuel found himself talking about things he rarely shared. Stories of Sarah, of Michael, of growing up on this farm with parents who had chosen him, not by blood but by love. "I was 4 when they adopted me," he told them, stirring his coffee. "Don't remember much from before. Just fragments, really." James, now looking better after taking medicine, asked, "You ever try to find your birth family?" Samuel shook his head. "My adoptive parents were my real family in every way that mattered." He hesitated. "Still, sometimes I wonder who I look like, where I came from." A sudden crack of thunder rattled the windows. Outside, headlights appeared on the rural road, creeping toward Samuel's driveway. "More folks stranded, I bet," Samuel murmured, rising from his chair. "I'll go see if they need help." Minutes later, he returned with 2 more unexpected guests, a middle-aged police officer and his teenage daughter. "This is Officer David Wilson and his daughter Emma," Samuel introduced. "Their car hydroplaned near the bridge. We were coming back from my mother's 80th birthday," Officer Wilson explained. "Didn't expect the storm to hit this hard." "You're welcome to stay," Samuel said warmly. "Coffee's brewing. Plenty of food." As everyone settled into the living room, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that Officer Wilson was watching him. The man seemed unsettled. He kept glancing at Samuel when he thought no one was looking. Finally Samuel asked, "Something wrong?" Officer Wilson blinked. "No, sorry. You just remind me of someone." Samuel had heard that before. Having no knowledge of his birth family, he often wondered if he'd unknowingly passed relatives on the street, someone who shared his eyes, his mannerisms, his blood. Later that night, as the storm continued its relentless assault, Samuel prepared more coffee. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Officer Wilson staring at a photo on the fridge. "That's my son Michael," Samuel said. "Graduation day, 5 years ago." The officer nodded slowly. "You said earlier you were adopted. Do you mind if I ask, where?" "Cedar Grove Children's Home," Samuel replied, measuring the coffee grounds. "Closed years ago." "Why?" Wilson hesitated. Then, reaching into his wallet, he carefully pulled out a worn photograph. "I need to show you something." Samuel's heart pounded as the officer placed the old image on the table. It was a young couple, perhaps in their early 20s, holding a small boy. "That's my older brother Robert and his wife Jean," Officer Wilson said. "And their son Daniel. This was taken about 45 years ago." Samuel stared, breath hitching. The child in the picture had his cowlick, his slightly crooked smile. "They died in a car accident when Daniel was 3, the officer continued. "By the time we tracked him down, he'd already been placed in adoption. We never found out where." Samuel's hands trembled. What was their last name? Robert and Jean Miller. The name hit him like a tidal wave. Samuel stumbled to a drawer, pulling out an old date of placement. December 1978. Officer Wilson took a step closer, his eyes scanning Samuel's face with newfound intensity. "You've got the Miller nose," he murmured. "And that chin, that's my mother's chin." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. The kitchen, once filled with the soft crackle of the fireplace and quiet conversation, fell into a stunned silence. Only the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows remained. Samuel's gaze drifted back to the worn photograph, his mind grasping at memories buried deep, fragments just out of reach. A woman's laughter. A man's strong hands lifting him high. The scent of a particular aftershave, familiar yet nameless. Across the table, Officer Wilson exhaled, his voice quieter now. "I've been a police officer for 30 years. My whole career has been about finding people, piecing together lost connections. Never, not once, did I think I'd stumble across my own nephew by accident, in the middle of a storm." Samuel's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. 45 years of questions came crashing down at once. The thought of an entire family he had never known, people who had wondered about him, missed him, maybe even searched for him, it was too much. His surroundings blurred for a moment, the room feeling suddenly smaller, the air thick with emotions he wasn't sure how to process. I need some air, he muttered, pushing back his chair. He barely noticed the way his hands trembled as he made his way to the back porch. The storm be damned. Officer Wilson followed but kept a respectful distance. He understood. Some truths needed time to settle. The rain drummed against the wooden porch roof as Samuel leaned heavily on the railing. Lightning streaked across the sky, casting brief, eerie shadows over the fields beyond. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, mixing with the rawness of the moment. Wilson spoke gently, not wanting to overwhelm him. I know this is a lot to take in. It's a shock. Take your time. Samuel closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. All these years, I thought I had no one, no real family, no history. He had convinced himself long ago that there was nothing left to find. And yet, here was this man, a blood relative, telling him that his past wasn't lost, just hidden. My mother. Samuel swallowed hard. I always believed she was just gone, that there was no one left. Wilson's voice was steady, but there was something else in it too, hope. She never stopped wondering about you. She's still alive, Samuel. 80 years old now. Sharp as ever. Samuel turned, his expression unreadable. My mother is your mother's mother. He said the words slowly, testing how they felt in his mouth. It was as if saying them aloud made them more real. Wilson nodded. That's right. And she'd give anything to meet you. He hesitated before adding, she has albums full of pictures of Robert and Jean, and some of you as a baby. If you ever want to see them,